Hello and welcome to With This Ring, You'll Be Dead, the acceptance of violence against female protagonists in romantic vampire fiction. I'm Michelle Renee Lane, and I am obsessed with vampires. Where did this obsession begin? Well, probably around the age of 11 when I read Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire. And let's see, that was about 37 years ago. And in that time, since I read the novel, I read a lot of other vampire fiction and lore, as well as academic works on the subject. And I've also consumed a lot of TV shows and films about vampires. Vampires also tend to show up in my own fiction, including the vampire antagonist in my Stoker-nominated debut novel, Invisible Chains, which is a fictional slave narrative set in antebellum New Orleans, and it's told from the POV of a young female slave. So you could say I know a thing or two about vampires, and because I consume so many narratives about them, I've noticed some trends or tropes within romantic vampire fiction that I find problematic. And the most problematic trope that I've encountered is the acceptance of violence towards female characters, which I'm going to talk about in this presentation. So there are a lot of TV shows or novels I could talk about that illustrate this troubling trope, but I'm going to focus primarily on two series of novels, Stephenie Meyer's Twilight Saga and Deborah Harkness's All Souls trilogy. I'll also be talking about a few other novels, but these two series are the focus of this presentation. Mainly because they've had such a major impact on popular culture. And, you know, vampires are more prevalent in popular culture than many people realize. But these particular novels have shaped the way several generations not only view vampires, but also romance in general. I'll also be talking about the TV series The Vampire Diaries, which is based on a series of YA novels by L.J. Smith that was adapted for TV by Julie Plec. So why am I focusing on these specific narratives? Well, first, like I said, they're extremely popular and have a very wide and diverse audience. But I'm also focusing on them because those audiences are predominantly made up of girls and women between the ages of roughly 11 to 60. Okay, great. Why does that matter? Well, it matters because these narratives depict romantic relationships between vampires and humans, sometimes between vampires and witches or other paranormal beings, but mainly humans. And the vampires are typically the romantic male leads. Traditionally, vampires were terrifying monsters. They climbed out of their graves to prey on the living, and they hunted humans so that they could drink their blood, and they were feared. They were not what you would consider an ideal date to the prom. But modern vampires are very different. And this change probably began around 1819 with the publication of John Polidori's The Vampire. In this short story, Polidori created Lord Ruthven, who is a vampire that he describes as a suave British nobleman. Polidori wrote this story as part of the famous writing competition between Mary Shelley, Lord Byron, and Percy Shelley that also produced one of the most famous novels ever, Frankenstein. Prior to Polidori's story, vampires usually only appeared in folklore and were sometimes blamed for unexpected outbreaks of illness, like consumption. They were undead monsters who were used as a scapegoat to explain the spread of disease to the living. So modern vampires tend to be more like Lord Ruthven in that they are handsome, wealthy, charming, manipulative, and they appeal to our sense of taboo. They're usually very strong and powerful, and they tend to live a long time without any outward signs of aging. If you've read any contemporary romantic vampire fiction, you're also familiar with the idea that vampires are highly sexualized. Some notable series with what I consider smoking hot vampires include the Anita Blake Vampire Hunter series, Janine Frost's Night Huntress series, and Charlaine Harris's Southern Vampire Mysteries. So let's not kid ourselves, okay? Vampires are highly sexualized monsters that many of us fantasize about without apology. They're dangerous and skilled lovers, and they occupy some of our darkest thoughts about sex and death. They appeal to our shadow selves and allow us to explore taboo desires. In contemporary romantic vampire fiction, such as the Twilight Saga and the All Souls trilogy, as well as the Vampire Diaries TV show, vampires have not only become the romantic male leads, but their violence and unquenchable thirst for blood is often overlooked by female protagonists as personality flaws. They're compared to things like alcoholism or gambling addiction or something as mundane as snoring. But the violence is either ignored or excused until it progressively escalates and becomes almost impossible for the female protagonist to break free of their situations. So in my close readings of these narratives, I've identified 4 stages of violence in romantic relationships with vampires: stalking, seduction, dating, and marriage. Stage 1 is stalking. Merriam-Webster defines stalking as the act or crime of willfully and repeatedly following or harassing another person in circumstances that would cause a reasonable person to fear injury or death, especially because of express or implied threats. Like serial killers, vampires stalk their prey. Initially, stalking might seem harmless, but creepy, yeah, sure, but dangerous, maybe not so much. However, stalking often leads to a more violent behavior. And if your stalker is a serial killer or vampire, you're almost 100% guaranteed bodily harm. So stalking is like hunting for vampires, and it is extremely predatory behavior. Unfortunately, stalking has become a trope in romantic vampire fiction that is viewed as a sign that a vampire is interested in pursuing a relationship with the female protagonist. Vampires like Matthew Claremont in the All Souls trilogy and Edward Cullen in the Twilight Saga find it perfectly normal to climb through the window of a woman's apartment or house and watch her sleep without her knowledge or consent. Not only is this behavior considered romantic, but it's also viewed as a tactic for keeping the female protagonist safe while getting to know her. So, here is a list of questions to consider while reading your next vampire novel. You can look at them at your leisure. I'm not going to read them all to you, but what I want you to keep in mind is these questions are in no way meant to be a judgment of anyone's behavior. I'm simply establishing a pattern of behavior that typically goes along with romantic relationships in which one of the parties is a predator. So, Edward Cullen and Matthew Claremont stalk their intended partners prior to and in the initial phases of their relationships. Both vampires climb through windows to watch women sleep, and in each case, we're led to believe that this behavior is romantic rather than predatory. In fact, stalking is practically a form of foreplay in romantic vampire fiction. But make no mistake, stalking is a form of hunting, and when you are being hunted by a vampire, regardless of how you feel about them or how attracted you are to them, eventually As the hunted, you will end up injured, if not dead. Stalking is not romantic, and it doesn't matter if it's perceived as a form of romance in these novels. We should treat it as the crime it truly is. So, after your vampire secret admirer makes his intentions known by either telling you he likes to watch you sleep like Edward Cullen, or appointing himself as your personal bodyguard like Matthew Claremont, stage 2 is seduction. What is seduction? Some of us have been led to believe that it's a positive thing in which someone we find attractive performs a certain set of actions or behaviors to make themselves even more attractive. But Merriam-Webster defines seduction as the act or pressure of giving in to a desire, especially when ill-advised. So I think we can agree that vampires are seductive. We know that it's a bad idea to get involved with them, but because they're charming and good-looking, and they have amazing sex appeal, it's easy to overlook the danger. Damon Salvatore of the Vampire Diaries uses seduction almost as often as he uses violence to accomplish his goals. And Damon's primary goal is making Elena Gilbert fall in love with him. Damon makes a point of inserting himself into Elena's life and pursues her until she finally acknowledges her attraction to him and agrees to a sexual relationship. Matthew and Edward have a different approach to seduction. They are much more careful about how they interact with their female love interest and set limits around sexual contact with them. Matthew and Diana Bishop kiss and have oral sex, but no intercourse until their wedding night. Edward is extremely repressed and only agrees to have sex with Bella Swan on their honeymoon. So, are they upholding tradition, or are they withholding sex to control their partners? In Laurel K. Hamilton's first Anita Blake novel, Guilty Pleasures, we meet an extremely seductive French vampire named Jean-Claude. Guilty Pleasures is the name of the strip club Jean-Claude owns, where vampires and shapeshifters perform. And occasionally, Jean-Claude strips as a special treat for the customers or to attract a new love interest. When Jean-Claude and Anita meet, Anita is not only celibate, but also sexually repressed. But their working relationship slowly evolves into one of the hottest romantic relationships in speculative fiction. Seduction is actually one of Jean-Claude's vampire superpowers, much like mind reading, flight, compulsion, walking in daylight. This vampire's sex appeal actually has supernatural elements that categorize him as more of an incubus than a vampire. Jean-Claude weaponizes his skills of seduction to attract and manipulate people in his rise to power. He is a master of manipulation, often using his body and promises of mind-bending sex as bait to get what he wants. But he's still less dangerous than Matthew Claremont and Edward Cullen, in my opinion, because he never pretends to be anything else. Okay. Once a vampire succeeds in seducing the female protagonist, stage 3 is dating. Dating in the 21st century has become a process by which people use social media to find out more about potential partners. Whether you use dating apps like Bumble, Hinge, Match.com, OkCupid, Her, Grindr, eHarmony, or even Facebook, you're essentially being encouraged to stalk people online in the hopes that they will like to stalk you back. In fact, the dating app Happen, that's Happn, uses your GPS location to match you with potential partners who also use the app near you during your daily routine. So, in a sense, dating itself has become vampiric. Not only is stalking the new normal, but single people have access to multiple partners at any given time. Imagine all the different types of blood you could have access to. Unlike the formulaic plot devices of vampire romance novels, we regular humans have to go on a bunch of dates until we are fortunate enough to meet someone worth our time and energy. Now, try to imagine if you met a monster. What would it be like to date them? To be fair, I'm sure many of us, myself included, have dated monsters, at least the human variety. But what would it be like to date an actual vampire? I'm glad you asked. Obviously, dating humans can be dangerous, especially if your partner is abusive, physically, emotionally, or even psychologically. But we often don't know how dangerous they are until we begin to see red flags and examples of extreme behaviors. We know that vampires are dangerous. They're monsters who drink human blood. So why on earth would anyone want to date one? Well, duh, they're hot. So it's still important to keep in mind that even though they are very hot and appealing, no matter how sexy they are, they still are very dangerous. And if you choose to date them, you're putting yourself at risk for violent and abusive behavior from your partner. So Edward Cullen and Matthew Claremont are both excellent examples of inappropriate dating choices. But now I want to focus on two other vampires, Stefan and Damon Salvatore. Before I do that, I want to draw your attention to this list, which is a list of actual things Elena Gilbert does while dating Stefan and Damon. This is my list of things not to do when dating vampires. So, Stefan Salvatore seems like a nice guy. He's attractive, well-groomed, probably spends a fortune on hair products. He's friendly, but a bit aloof. And he doesn't seem to be very interested in forming bonds with the other students at Mystic Falls High, with the exception of Elena. They have several accidental meetings. They become friends, and then eventually they start dating. We know that Stefan is a vampire, but Elena doesn't. In fact, Stefan has a lot of secrets. For instance, Stefan has a bit of a drinking problem. When he drinks human blood, he develops a bloodlust that turns him into what is known as a ripper, meaning he feeds on his victims so aggressively that he severs their heads. And he has a list of victims that would put most serial killers to shame. For most of season 1 of the Vampire Diaries, we're led to believe that Stefan is a good dating option for Elena, even though he's a vampire and deeply in denial about what he is. But the lies he tells himself end up making him one of the most dangerous people in her life. Things get a little more complicated when Stefan's older brother Damon shows up. So the most important bit of information you need to know about Stefan and Damon is that a key theme in their backstory is betrayal. And it remains a theme throughout their relationship. Personally, I've been Team Damon since season 1. He's funnier, sexier, dresses better, and he is not in complete denial about what he is. As we learn more about Damon, he turns out to be more stable and reliable than Stefan. But he's still a vampire. So while dating not one, but 2 vampires, Elena becomes a pro at making bad decisions, as we saw on the previous slide. And because she's willing to put herself in danger again and again to be near these monsters, she eventually becomes a monster herself. I mean, technically vampirism is a sexually transmitted disease, and, you might not need to worry about teen pregnancy, but you could possibly end up undead. So after you date for a while and commit yourself to the new idea of loving a serial killer, that brings us to stage 4, marriage. Typically, there is no such thing as divorce for vampires. They take that whole, till death do us part thing very seriously. Happily ever after or not, vampires remain married to their spouses until one of them dies. Again, Matthew Claremont and Edward Cullen maintain strict rules about sexual contact with their partners until they are wed. Now, some people would argue that they are upholding traditional values, but I'm more inclined to view this as their efforts to contain female sexuality and ensure that their partner remains faithful to them. So not only is premarital sex off the table for Diana and Bella, but because their love interests continue to stalk and occupy all their time, there isn't space for meeting anyone else or engaging in casual sexual relationships with other partners. To a certain extent, vampires view their mates as property. A trope within romantic vampire fiction suggests that vampires are very territorial when it comes to their land, wealth, property, and by extension, anyone they love or have a sexual relationship with. Vampire culture has some very strict rules about wedlock. And Janine Frost explains vampire marriage through one of her male vampires, Spade, in First Drop of Crimson. Marriage in undead terms was far more rigid than a human marriage. He'd be risking Denise's life if he were married by vampire law. The punishment for anyone committing adultery with a vampire spouse was death without reprisal, should the wrong spouse choose to exercise his or her right. With their very long lives, no wonder marriage was an uncommon state for vampires. So, marriage is a serious thing in vampire society. There are a lot of rules around it, and it's a huge commitment. So a vampire marriage must be witnessed by other vampires and usually involves an exchange of blood or an oath, and the couple must consummate their marriage before or after the ceremony in order for vampire society to accept the union. But under vampire law, until a human becomes a vampire, they're not considered a true spouse. Which brings me to the fact that if you plan on marrying a vampire and want to have an eternity of happily ever after, the man you love will have to kill you and raise you as one of the undead. Now, most people would try to avoid being murdered by their lover. Bella Swan only agrees to get married if her fiancé agrees to kill her and make her a vampire before she turns 18. What's that saying? Live fast, die young, leave a pretty corpse. Yeah, okay. Well, in Breaking Dawn, the 4th book in the Twilight Saga, Bella shares some thoughts on what it means to love someone. You could run from someone you feared. You could try to fight someone you hated. All my reactions were geared toward those kinds of killers, the monsters, the enemies. When you loved the one who was killing you, it left you no options. How could you run? How could you fight when doing so would hurt that beloved one? If your life was all you had to give your beloved, how could you not give it? If it was someone you truly loved. Does it sound like love to you? I mean, it shouldn't, because giving your life to make a vampire or anyone else for that matter happy is suicide. Assisted suicide, but still suicide. And just when you thought things couldn't get any creepier, vampires can apparently impregnate human women in the Twilight Saga and certain kinds of witches in the All Souls trilogy. Now, Edward and Matthew were unaware that this is a possibility because vampires and humans or witches, they don't marry and mate. because it's forbidden. And it's probably forbidden because of the potential for hybrid vampires. Now, if turning a child into a vampire is a crime punishable by death among vampires, how do you think people are going to react to an abomination like a vampire baby? So, becoming pregnant with a monster is a common trope in horror fiction, with the most famous example being Ira Levin's Rosemary's Baby. Not only do mothers of monster children experience traumatic and painful pregnancies that endanger their lives, but the mothers also tend to be insanely protective of the monstrous offspring. So, whether you're pregnant with the Antichrist or a vampire hybrid, chances are that your fragile human body will not be a match for the monster growing inside you. Bella's pregnancy is an excellent example of body horror. In fact, it turns out Edward isn't really the one who kills Bella. Her child nearly kills her, and Edward has to end up turning her in order to save her. So why does this all matter? I mean, we're just talking about fiction, right? True, but we're talking about fiction that normalizes violence against women and teenage girls. Romanticized violence is problematic at best and potentially dangerous for teens and young women who haven't had much dating experience or suffer from a lack of self-esteem. I strongly recommend reading these novels as cautionary tales to help us identify abusive and narcissistic partners. While there are some obvious perks to marrying a vampire, like wealth, sex appeal, old world of charm, and of course, a staggering amount of white privilege, the cons often outweigh the pros. Most notably, the fact that your lover will eventually murder you if the relationship is going to last. So, we know that vampires are sexy. We can't argue that. And they're extremely fascinating creatures. But we really shouldn't use them as benchmarks for finding a mate. If you're interested in reading more about this topic, I've adapted this presentation from a 4-part blog series I wrote for speculativechick.com. And if you're interested in reading some of my vampire fiction, you can check out my novel, Invisible Chains, which is available from Amazon, Barnes & Noble, Payroll House Publishing, and other booksellers. If you have questions, you can feel free to contact me, and we can talk more about this topic, or if you just want to talk about vampires in general. It's my favorite subject. Thank you so much.
I am Dr. Elizabeth Rowich, and I'm a lecturer in film studies at the University of North Carolina, Wilmington. My presentation today is drawn from a class that I taught just last semester on the history of film exhibition. Research into film exhibition and its history is largely interested in questions about where, why, and how people have come together to both show and watch films over time. My talk today is going to draw upon and summarize a large body of work conducted by others in the field. And therefore, I feel a professional obligation to acknowledge from the beginning that what you're about to hear does not particularly contain an original intervention. I will, however, be drawing upon a large amount of research that I have personally done into marketing materials and other primary sources contained within the Media History Digital Library, the William K. Everson Collection at New York University, and the University of California, Berkeley's Art Museum and Pacific Film Archive. I'm going to start by making a guess that not everyone watching this video will be familiar with the word ballyhoo. Ballyhoo has definitely fallen out of the common vernacular, but as early as 1903, it was used within the American film exhibition industry as a synonym for terms such as marketing and publicity. More specifically, the managers of movie theaters used ballyhoo as a term to indicate a brash and extravagant variety of promotional showmanship that involved the use of stunts or gimmicks. Ballyhooing, as a verb, embraced the practice of exploitation advertising long before the exploitation film existed as a production practice. Producer-director William Castle was the undisputed king of ballyhoo, from Michael and Harry Medved's Golden Turkey Awards book, first published in 1980, to the Mystery Science Theater 3000 stage show, Riff Tracks Live, which ran from 2009 to 2019. Castle's horror films have become ironically celebrated for their campy performances and low-budget production design. However, within their original historical context, they were repeatedly credited with reinvigorating ballyhoo as a promotional tactic through their use of technological gimmicks, which encouraged audience participation with the films. As Castle himself said in a 1959 interview, "You have to have a gimmick and an exploitation campaign if you don't have a film with a lot of stars." And he would go on to reiterate that there is no such thing as a B picture anymore. A film is either successful or unsuccessful, regardless of its cost. It has an audience hook, or it doesn't, and that's that. An executive from Columbia Pictures told Film Bulletin in 1959 the company spent, and I quote directly, "as much on merchandising these gimmick items as we do on the pictures themselves, and it usually pays off." In this presentation, I will argue that the ballyhooing of William Castle's gimmick horror films is part of a broader discourse on the changing relationship between spectator and screen that occurred within post-war film exhibition. I'll be doing this in 3 parts. I'll begin by providing a little bit of context for what was happening historically at the time that these films appeared. I then want to give an overview of Castle's gimmick films and what their gimmicks were, focusing in particular on The Tingler as a case study. And then I want to think about the broader implications of Castle's films and the way that audiences interacted with them, and the way in which Castle's legacy might continue in the present. After World War II, film exhibition practices would change dramatically for a number of reasons. The American population itself was changing. From 1946 to 1964, there was mass migration to the suburbs, coupled with the baby boom. Couples were marrying younger. They were having their children younger. And they were having more children than they had in the past across all segments of the population. With more kids came increased costs. There was less money, therefore, to spend on luxuries like entertainment. It was tempting to pay just a one-time cost for a television set, which brought moving image media directly into the home. After all, watching TV required no babysitting fees, and no public transportation costs, and no parking fees. To combat the resulting decline in movie theater attendance, the film exhibition industry turned to new technology to differentiate its product from television and radio, and to lure its audience back into the movie theater in the process by offering an experience that could not be easily duplicated within the home. Or, more accurately, it used newly popular technologies because many of the practices that it adopted, like full color filmmaking, the use of stereophonic sound, widescreen formats, and stereoscopic imagery, had all existed before World War II. It was only when television started turning a profit and competing with the profits generated by the film industry that there was a perceived need to use these new technologies on such a scale and basis that they became standard practice. Film historian John Belton has argued that it was particularly the advent of widescreen exhibition and stereophonic sound that transformed the relationship between spectators and the screen. For example, Cinerama extended the image even beyond the frame's border through strategically placed speakers on the sides, ceiling, and rear walls of the theater. And the widescreen's curved screen violated the proscenium arch of the theater. There was no longer a clear separation between the world of the film and the world of the audience. And as a result, Belton argues that widescreen cinema became identified with the notion of audience participation. Belton builds his argument through an examination of advertisements for Cinerama in comparison to advertisements for 3D movies, concluding that the advertising for these technologies offered similar but inverted experiences. Cinerama, for example, promised to put the audience in the film, plunging and pulling viewers almost physically into the picture. Whereas 3D promised to put the film within the space of the movie theater, with images that came right at you, putting a lion in your lap and a lover in your arms. William Castle's participatory screening techniques would similarly encourage immersive viewing through different sensory and decidedly sensational experiences. For example, in 1959, he ballyhooed his horror film The House on Haunted Hill by repeatedly promoting the film's usage of Emergo, a new screen technology that required special installation within the space of the movie theater and purportedly allowed the thrills to fly right into the audience. What was this gimmick? Well, it was a skeleton on a wire that emerged from behind the screen and flew over the heads of viewers at a pivotal moment within the film. Its effectiveness was arguably undercut by the fact that exhibitors had no easy way to return the skeleton to behind the screen while the film was still playing. and therefore it tended more often than not to awkwardly hang in mid-air until the film's conclusion. As Belton argues with regard to promotion around 3D movies, Emergo sought to create an immersive experience in which the world of the film would intrude upon the world of the viewer. Other gimmicks, however, do not easily fall into one of Belton's two advertising tropes. For example, 13 Ghosts promoted the debut of the gimmick Illusion O, a ghost viewer with thin, transparent plastic in both red and blue colors that allowed viewers to see or to block out the film's ghosts. And Homicidal featured Coward's Corner, a trail of paper arrows, specifically labeled the Yellow Streak, that led from the theater to a booth that was offering refunds for anyone too terrified to watch the full film. Dramatically, viewers have until the timer on screen runs out to take full advantage of this money-back guarantee. And Mr. Sardonicus featured the punishment pole, a glow-in-the-dark reversible ballot card with a thumbs up or thumbs down illustration, depending on how it was oriented, that was used to select the final reel of the film as the film was playing. The audience's judgment determined the fate of the title character. Illusion O, Coward's Corner, and the punishment pole do not exist within the world of the film, and they also don't seem to be extending the world of the film into the theater. They fall somewhere in between. However, I particularly want to focus in on the Tingler as a case study and examine its unique marketing gimmick, Percepto, which the poster of the film proclaimed to be the newest and most startling gimmick on the screen. The trailer for the film set high expectations for the audience. Castle himself appears and addresses the camera, assuring viewers that you too will feel every shocking sensation of the Tingler through the magic of Percepto, and that when they entered the theater, they would receive special instructions and equipment that would guard them against the Tingler's attack, which was important because Castle himself personally guaranteed that the Tingler would break loose in the theater while viewers were in the audience. So, what then was Percepto? What did it do? And how did exhibitors do it? Well, according to the equipment manual for Percepto, as stated on page 3, this Percepto kit has been developed to heighten audience participation when viewing the Tingler. A percentage of the seats are rigged with tiny electric motors, which, when activated, result in a harmless vibration being felt by the person sitting in the seat. More specifically, the manual outlined the contents of 2 crates containing 100 mini vibrator motors and a timing device along with other installation materials. There was a diagram provided with instructions for wiring, acknowledging that most movie theaters at the time had more than 100 seats in terms of their maximum occupancy, and therefore guidance was given to set up the percepto motors in, quote, those rows most frequently occupied. The entire system was wired in such a way that it could be operated from the projection booth, and it was the job of the projector to cue the vibration at key moments in the film, as well as operating the house lights, turning them up and down again at moments when the film itself pauses and instructs the theater management to do so. As a result, Percepto was not particularly popular with projectionists' unions, which objected to the extra workload. Film director John Waters has also reflected as part of a documentary on William Castle about how it was incredibly obvious to moviegoers that something about the theatrical space had changed. And he recollects how he and his friends would try to arrive at screenings of The Tingler early in order to flip up all the seats and see which of them had motors affixed and which did not. Would have been an incredible letdown to attend The Tingler and not experience the shocking and tingling sensations that you had been promised. Castle was able to guarantee that The Tingler would break loose in every theater because the manual for Percepto also provided specific and detailed instructions about how the exhibitor should organize and carry out what it called an auditorium stunt. Specifically, it required hiring an actress to scream and pretend to faint at one particular moment on screen where the film itself and its narrative halts to announce that the Tingler has broken loose. Two ushers were then supposed to bring in a stretcher, army type preferred, and lift the girl out of her seat and carry her into the manager's office, where she would miraculously recover and wait for the film to conclude. The manual reiterates the importance of rehearsing this stunt multiple times because timing is of the essence. There are only 15 seconds in which the house lights come up, and therefore the girl must be loaded onto the stretcher while the rest of the audience is able to see it taking place. In fact, the manual goes as far as suggesting that 2 actresses are hired for this stunt so that they can relieve each other for the matinee or evening performance and therefore not work in excess of 8 hours a day. In 1960, the Motion Picture Herald published a series of photographs documenting one theater's performance of the auditorium stunt, in which I don't know about you, but I don't actually see evidence of screaming or fainting. In fact, the audience looks not very engaged in what's going on around them until that final photograph of the stretcher. We see people standing with heads turned and angled in concern. Clearly, this act has changed their viewing experience. It has brought the world of the film into the world of the theater. The equipment that audiences were given to combat the Tingler was a simple instruction: scream. It's implied that the world of the film has invaded the world of the theater, but the world of the theater has the power to return the world of the film to its rightful position. Therefore, The discourse around the tingler, as established through merchandising materials like the Percepto Manual and publicity materials like promotional stories in the Motion Picture Herald, frame these viewing practices as simultaneously regressive, as if they wished that viewing practices could return to a pre-war era, and embracing the new immersive interactive experience of post-war viewing practices. The very act of sitting and viewing is framed within this discourse as immersive experience. Like widescreen and surround sound, Castle's gimmicks sought to extend and simultaneously question that extension of the world of the film. For me, the most intriguing aspect of all of this would be the questions that it ultimately raises about William Castle's legacy. To what degree do we recognize the continuation of Castle's gimmick film ballyhoo marketing, and or the interactive viewing practices that his films sought to create in today's film market? For example, should we frame the development of technologies like D-Box seat motion or the environmental effects and experience that are promoted within 4DX as a continuation of the Tingler's vibrating seats, seeking to engage the viewer through senses beyond sight and sound? For example, this advertisement for 4DX seems to suggest an experience much like advertising for 3D films in the 1950s. It's bringing the world of the movie into the theater through the use of smoke effects and pyrotechnics, or physical environmental effects like rain and snow and wind and bubbles, or changes in temperature, or the release of scent. How do we understand the way that IMAX and Screen X continue to expand and extend the screen further than ever before? If all it took in the 1950s was the simple shift to an increasingly widescreen aspect ratio to further immerse the viewer within the film's world, what effect does it have when the image occupies 3 of the 4 theater walls, creating 270-degree panoramic views? Should we see evidence of Castle's legacy in how some films, especially within a cult cinema context, actively encourage audience participation, from call and response with a film's dialogue to screencasting and the act of performing action from the film live as the film itself is being played, to other kinds of physical interaction, such as at Prince Charles Theatre in London, England, where during monthly screenings of the movie The Room, audiences engage with the film by throwing plastic spoons at the screen whenever they see the framed portrait of a spoon within the protagonist Johnny's living room. All of these practices seek to establish an experience that cannot be easily replicated at home, and that therefore arguably serve to drive audiences back to the movie theater within our current contemporary age of easy at-home digital streaming. It's interesting then that ads for home theater systems seem to also engage in discourses that Belton addressed, such as how home theater sound systems can extend sound beyond the screen or plunge you directly into the picture. And I know my students had a hard time spotting this, so I will point out that in those images from the film Gladiator and the film Titanic, you will notice in the background there is a person eating popcorn and watching who has been photoshopped into those scenes, suggesting that the LG home theater experience is particularly immersive. Finally, we could think about how virtual reality seems to offer the ultimate immersive experience, putting viewers within the movie as never before. I'm also intrigued by to what degree these questions and debates around audience participation and the viewing experience particularly apply to horror as a genre. Do other genres of film encourage the same degree of immersion within a film as horror narratives? And I look forward to continuing this conversation with all of you in the chat. Please feel free to reach out and contact me through my email address, rowich@uncw.edu, if you have any questions.